What's the most disturbing thing a family member convinced you was normal until someone else pointed it out? My father taught me how to exploit elderly people when I was 12 years old, but he called it helping with the family business. I spent 6 years working alongside him every weekend, driving to retirement homes and assisted living facilities, knocking on doors, and offering handyman services to people who could barely remember our names from one visit to the next. He'd tell them we'd fixed their leaky faucet 3 weeks ago when we'd never been there before, show them an invoice for work we'd never done, and collect payment while they smiled and thanked us for being so reliable. I thought we were providing a valuable service to people who needed help. My girlfriend, Rachel, was the first person who looked at me with horror and said, "That's elder abuse. Your father is stealing from people with dementia." I was 18 years old, sitting in her parents' kitchen, casually mentioning how my dad had taught me to get cash instead of checks because it was easier for the clients, and she'd stopped mid-bite of her sandwich to stare at me. Her mother, who worked as a social worker, asked me to explain exactly what my father's business involved, and I walked through our typical weekend routine without understanding why both women looked increasingly disturbed. I described how we'd visit Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman every Saturday morning, how she'd always seem surprised to see us, how my dad would remind her we were there to check on the electrical work we'd done last month, and how she'd write a check for $300 while apologizing for forgetting we were coming. Rachel's mother, Patricia Greenfield, asked me how many times we'd actually done electrical work for Mrs. Hoffman, and I said probably never, because my dad wasn't an electrician. We mostly just tightened loose doorknobs and changed light bulbs. She asked how my father justified charging $300 for that, and I explained that he'd tell the clients we'd done much more extensive work during previous visits they'd forgotten about. The look Patricia gave me made my stomach turn cold because it was the same expression I'd seen teachers give kids who'd said something revealing about abuse at home without realizing what they were revealing. She asked if my father kept records of the actual work we performed versus the work he billed for, and I said he kept 2 sets of books, one for tracking purposes and one for client records. Rachel said, "That's fraud. Your dad is committing fraud against people who can't defend themselves." I felt defensive at first, explaining that my father had always told me we were providing peace of mind, that these elderly people needed to believe someone was taking care of their homes, and that the money was really for that service, not the actual repairs. Patricia asked me if I understood that people with dementia were considered vulnerable adults under state law, and that financially, exploiting them was a crime. I sat there realizing that the business I'd been proud to help build, the work ethic my father had instilled in me, and the college fund we'd accumulated over 6 years had all been built on systematically stealing from the most vulnerable people in our community. I went home that night and couldn't look at my father the same way. He was sitting in his recliner watching a basketball game, eating microwave popcorn, looking like the same man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework. But now I saw him through Patricia's eyes, and I couldn't unsee what she'd made me recognize. I asked him if what we did was legal, and he muted the television, turned to me with a patient smile, and said, "We provide a service. These people are paying for reliability and consistency. That has value." I said Rachel's mother thought it sounded wrong, and his expression shifted to something colder. He said Rachel's mother didn't understand business, didn't understand how the world worked, and didn't understand that these elderly people were happy to have someone checking on them. He said most of them had families who never visited, who dumped them in facilities and forgot about them, and we were the closest thing to family many of them had. He made it sound noble, made it sound necessary, and for a moment I wanted to believe him because believing him meant I wasn't complicit in something horrible. But Patricia's words kept echoing in my mind about vulnerable adults and financial exploitation and fraud. My mother came in from the kitchen and asked what we were discussing, and my father said I'd been talking to people who didn't understand our business model. She said, "Some people don't understand entrepreneurship, honey. Your father has built something valuable here." The way they united against my questions made me realize this conversation was one I couldn't win in that moment. I started paying attention differently during our weekend rounds. We visited 23 regular clients, mostly in their late 70s through 90s, most living in assisted living facilities or senior apartment complexes. My father had developed relationships with the facility's staff, bringing coffee and donuts every few weeks, chatting with nurses and administrators, positioning himself as a reliable resource for residents who needed minor household help. I'd always thought this was good business networking. Now I noticed how he'd ask staff members which residents had memory issues, which ones had family nearby, and which ones had the most financial resources. He called it targeting our services efficiently. I was starting to see it as selecting victims. On that Saturday, we visited a man named Albert Kowalski who lived in the Harborview Senior Apartments. My father knocked on his door holding a toolbox and a clipboard, and when Albert opened the door looking confused, my father said, "Good morning, Mr. Kowalski. We're here to finish the plumbing work we started last week." Albert invited us in, apologizing for not remembering, explaining his memory wasn't what it used to be. My father spent 20 minutes tightening the handle on Albert's bathroom faucet, a task that required no actual plumbing knowledge, then presented an invoice for $425 for emergency plumbing repairs completed over 2 visits. Albert wrote a check without questioning it, thanked us for our excellent work, and offered us coffee. I felt sick watching him sign that check because he genuinely believed he owed us that money for work we'd never done. In the car afterward, I asked my father how he could justify charging 420 files for tightening a faucet handle, and he said I was thinking about it wrong. He said Albert was paying for reliability, for having someone he trusted, for the peace of mind that came from believing his apartment was being maintained by professionals. I said that wasn't what the invoice claimed, and my father said invoices were just paperwork. What mattered was the relationship and the service. I asked what would happen if Albert's family saw that invoice and questioned the charges, and my father said Albert's son lived in California and called maybe once a month. He said this with confidence, with specific knowledge, and I realized my father researched these people before targeting them. He knew who had involved family members and who was isolated. He knew who would question charges and who would pay without pushback. His business model wasn't about providing services. It was about identifying vulnerable people with limited oversight and extracting maximum money while giving minimum actual assistance. The sick feeling in my stomach intensified when I understood this wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic. My father had built an entire business infrastructure around exploiting elderly people with cognitive decline, and he'd trained me to help him do it since I was 12 years old. Rachel asked me to stop working with my father, and I agreed immediately because I couldn't participate anymore knowing what I knew. My father was furious when I told him I was done with weekend rounds. He said I was throwing away 6 years of training and experience, that I was letting some girl influence my judgment, and that I was betraying the family business we'd built together. My mother supported him completely, saying I was being ungrateful and judgmental about work that had paid for my clothes, my food, and my college fund. I said the college fund was built on fraud, and my mother slapped me across the face, the first time she'd hit me since I was a child. She said I didn't get to take the moral high ground after benefiting from that money for 6 years. She was right about that part. I had benefited. I'd spent money earned through systematically stealing from people with dementia, and I'd done it without questioning because my father had taught me to see it as normal business practice. The guilt was crushing, because I hadn't been an innocent child throughout most of this. From 15 onward, I'd been old enough to recognize something was wrong, but I'd chosen not to examine it too closely, because examining it meant acknowledging my own complicity. Rachel's mother had forced me to examine it, and now I couldn't look away from what my father was doing, what I'd helped him do, and what would continue happening if nobody stopped him. I told Patricia everything during a 3-hour conversation in her office at the Department of Social Services. She recorded my statement with permission, taking detailed notes while I described our client list, our billing practices, my father's research methods for selecting targets, and the system of fake invoices he maintained. She asked if I had any documentation, and I said my father kept everything on a laptop in his home office, 2 different spreadsheets tracking actual work versus billed work. She asked why he'd keep evidence of fraud, and I said he was proud of his system, proud of how much money he generated from minimal actual labor. He'd taught me from those spreadsheets, showing me how to maximize billing while minimizing time investment. She asked if I'd be willing to testify if the state pursued charges, and I said yes without hesitation, even knowing what that would mean for my relationship with my family. Patricia said she'd be contacting the state's Adult Protective Services Division and potentially the district attorney's office, and that I should prepare for my family to react badly when they learned I'd reported them. She said, people who exploited vulnerable adults rarely accepted responsibility, typically blamed whistleblowers, and often tried to paint themselves as victims of misunderstanding. She was describing my parents perfectly before she'd even met them. I left her office feeling both relieved and terrified, because I'd just set in motion a process that would destroy my family, but continuing to stay silent felt impossible now that I understood what my father really was. The investigation moved faster than I expected. An investigator named David Brenner from Adult Protective Services contacted me within a week, asking for more detailed information about specific clients. I provided names, addresses, approximate amounts my father had charged them, and descriptions of the minimal work we'd actually performed. David said they'd be conducting interviews with the clients I'd mentioned and reviewing financial records from the facilities where my father operated. He asked if my father had any business licenses or credentials for the work he claimed to perform, and I said no, he'd always operated as an independent handyman without any formal licensing. David explained that unlicensed contracting combined with defrauding vulnerable adults would likely result in criminal charges, not just civil penalties. He asked if I understood that my testimony might send my father to prison, and I said I understood. And I'd testify anyway, because what he was doing to these people was wrong, regardless of whose father he was. David said he'd been investigating elder abuse cases for 11 years, and it was rare for family members to come forward, that most enablers chose family loyalty over victim protection. I said I'd chosen wrong for 6 years by staying silent, and I wasn't choosing wrong anymore. The conviction in my voice surprised me because I'd spent the previous week second-guessing whether I was overreacting, whether Patricia had influenced me too much, whether my father's explanation about providing peace of mind had some validity. But talking to David, hearing him describe my father's actions as criminal elder abuse without hesitation, confirmed that my instincts were right, and my father's rationalizations were exactly what Patricia had warned me they'd be. My father was arrested 3 weeks later at our house during dinner. 2 detectives and a uniformed officer came to the door with a warrant, and I watched from the hallway while they handcuffed him in our kitchen. My mother screamed at them about harassment, about false accusations, about overzealous social workers who didn't understand business. One of the detectives, a woman named Lieutenant Sharon Vega, calmly explained that they had evidence of systematic financial exploitation of vulnerable adults and multiple counts of fraud. My father looked directly at me and said, "You did this. You destroyed your own family." My mother turned to me with absolute hatred in her eyes and said, "Get out of my house. You're not my son anymore." I grabbed my jacket and left through the back door while my mother sobbed and my father was led to the police car. Rachel picked me up 3 blocks away, and I sat in her passenger seat shaking while she drove to her parents' house. Patricia had prepared their guest room for me, anticipating this moment, understanding that families rarely welcomed the person who exposed their crimes. I lived with Rachel's family for the next 4 months while the case progressed through the legal system. My parents refused to speak to me, refused to acknowledge my existence, and told extended family members I'd fabricated lies to destroy them because I had mental health issues. Several aunts and uncles believed this narrative and called me to say I needed psychiatric help and should recant my false testimony before I ruined an innocent man's life. My grandfather was the only blood relative who supported me, calling to say he'd always suspected my father's business was dishonest, but had never imagined the extent of it. The district attorney assigned to the case was a prosecutor named Lisa Thornburg, who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. She met with me multiple times to prepare my testimony, walking through every client I remembered, every fraudulent invoice, every conversation where my father had explained his system. She said they'd interviewed 19 of the 23 clients on the list I'd provided, and 16 of them had clear evidence of being overcharged for work that was never performed or was grossly inflated in price. 3 clients had died since I'd stopped working with my father, and their families had discovered hundreds of dollars in fraudulent charges when reviewing bank statements. One family had found invoices totaling $7,800 for electrical work that was never done, paid to my father over an 8-month period by a woman with advanced Alzheimer's who believed he was her nephew. Lisa said the total fraud amount they could document exceeded $150,000 over a 5-year period, possibly much more if you included clients from earlier years whose records were no longer available. She said my father would be charged with 31 counts of felony financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, 31 counts of fraud, and multiple counts of unlicensed contracting. He faced up to 15 years in prison if convicted on all charges. My testimony would be crucial because I could establish his systematic approach, his intentional targeting of people with cognitive decline, and his deliberate maintenance of false records. Lisa asked if I felt conflicted about testifying against my father, and I said I felt conflicted about having participated for 6 years without recognizing what we were doing, but I didn't feel conflicted about stopping him now. The preliminary hearing was brutal. My father's attorney, a defense lawyer named Robert Ashford who specialized in white-collar crime, tried to portray my father as a hard-working small business owner who'd made some billing errors but had no criminal intent. He argued that the clients had been happy with the services provided and that any overcharging was the result of poor record-keeping, not fraud. The prosecutor presented testimony from 3 victims or their families describing how my father had manipulated them. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman's daughter testified that her mother had paid my father more than $12,000 over 2 years for work that was either unnecessary or never performed, depleting her savings account that was meant for her care. Albert Kowalski's son testified that his father had written checks totaling $8,400 to my father for plumbing and electrical work that left no evidence of ever being done, and that his father's cognitive decline had made him unable to accurately assess whether the work was necessary or completed. A woman named Dorothy Chen, who died 3 months earlier, had family members present bank statements showing $9,600 in payments to my father's business, with invoices describing extensive home repairs that the assisted living facility confirmed had never been authorized or performed. Robert Ashford tried to suggest that these families were misunderstanding legitimate business expenses, but the sheer volume of fraudulent charges and the consistent pattern across multiple victims made his argument increasingly hollow. The judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and denied my father's request for reduced bail, citing him as a flight risk who demonstrated systematic predatory behavior toward vulnerable people. My testimony during the trial lasted 2 full days. Lisa walked me through my entire history with my father's business, starting from when I was 12, and he'd first brought me along to help carry tools. I described how he'd taught me to talk to elderly clients, how to identify people with memory problems, how to reference work we'd supposedly done during previous visits that never happened. I explained the dual record-keeping system, how one spreadsheet tracked our actual time and materials, while another tracked the inflated charges we billed clients. I testified about specific clients and specific fraudulent charges, describing Mrs. Hoffman's confusion when we'd tell her we'd fixed her electrical outlet last week, and Mr. Kowalski's apologetic demeanor when he couldn't remember calling us for plumbing work. Robert Ashford's cross-examination focused on trying to paint me as an unstable young man who'd turned on his family under the influence of his girlfriend and her social worker mother. He asked if Patricia Greenfield had coached me on what to say, if she'd influenced my interpretation of innocent business practices, if I had any grudge against my father that might motivate false testimony. I said no to all of these, explaining that I'd simply described our actual practices and that any reasonable person would recognize them as fraudulent once they were described plainly. He asked why I'd participated for 6 years if I thought the practices were wrong, and I said I hadn't thought they were wrong because my father had convinced me they were normal, which was exactly what this trial was about. That answer seemed to resonate with the jury because several of them nodded while I said it. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses who testified about elder abuse patterns, cognitive decline in dementia patients, and the specific vulnerability factors my father had exploited. A geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Foster explained that people with dementia often mask their memory problems through social graces and learned behavior patterns, making them appear more cognitively intact than they actually are. He said predators who target this population understand how to exploit that gap between social presentation and actual cognitive function, building trust through repeated contacts while extracting money through false claims the victim can't verify. He'd reviewed records from 6 of my father's clients and concluded that all of them had shown clear signs of cognitive impairment that would have been obvious to anyone interacting with them regularly, meaning my father had knowingly targeted people he understood couldn't protect themselves. A financial crimes analyst named Beverly Wright testified about the billing patterns in my father's records, showing that charges consistently increased for clients with documented memory problems while remaining stable for clients with intact cognition. She said this demonstrated deliberate differential pricing based on vulnerability, not honest billing for services rendered. The defense tried to argue these patterns were coincidental, but Beverly presented statistical analysis showing the correlation was too consistent to be accidental. The economic impact testimony was devastating. Multiple families described the financial hardship caused by my father's theft, including depleted savings accounts, unpaid care facility bills, and reduced quality of life for victims who'd trusted him. One family had to move their mother to a lower quality facility because my father had stolen enough money that they could no longer afford her current placement. My mother testified for the defense, which I'd expected but still hurt to watch. She claimed my father was innocent, that he'd provided genuine services, and that I'd been manipulated by outside influences into betraying my family. She described him as a devoted father and hard-working provider who'd been destroyed by a vindictive son with psychological problems. Robert Ashford asked if I'd ever shown signs of mental instability, and she said I'd become increasingly paranoid and aggressive after meeting Rachel, suggesting my girlfriend had brainwashed me into viewing innocent activities as criminal. Lisa's cross-examination demolished this narrative by asking my mother specific questions about the business practices. She asked if my mother had ever reviewed the dual spreadsheets, and my mother admitted she had. She asked if my mother understood that one spreadsheet showed actual work performed while the other showed inflated charges billed to clients, and my mother said that was normal business accounting. Lisa asked if my mother considered it normal to charge a woman with Alzheimer's $7,800 for electrical work that was never done, and my mother said the work had been done, it was documented. Lisa presented testimony from the assisted living facility confirming no electrical work had ever been performed or authorized, and asked my mother to explain that discrepancy. My mother said the facility must be lying to protect themselves, and Lisa pointed out that the facility had no financial incentive to lie since they didn't benefit from my father's fraud. My mother's testimony shifted from defending my father to attacking me personally, calling me ungrateful and cruel, saying I destroyed our family for attention and sympathy. The jury looked uncomfortable during this portion, and I saw several of them glance at me with what looked like sympathy. The verdict came back after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on 28 counts of felony financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, guilty on 28 counts of fraud, guilty on 6 counts of unlicensed contracting. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, and my father was remanded to custody without bail, pending sentencing. I sat in the courtroom gallery next to Rachel while the verdict was read, and I felt an overwhelming mix of relief and grief because I'd just helped send my father to prison, but I'd also stopped him from hurting more elderly people who couldn't defend themselves. My mother stood up screaming when the verdict was announced, calling the jury corrupt and calling me evil, and had to be escorted from the courtroom by security. Several family members who'd attended the trial to support my father turned to glare at me as they left, and one uncle said loud enough for me to hear that I'd rot in hell for what I'd done to my own father. Patricia was sitting 2 rows behind me, and she came forward to squeeze my shoulder, saying I'd done the right thing and saved countless future victims. Lisa came over after the courtroom cleared and said my testimony had been crucial, that without my insider knowledge of the system, they wouldn't have been able to prove the systematic nature of the fraud. She said I should be proud of my courage in coming forward, especially knowing it would destroy my relationship with my parents. I didn't feel proud. I felt exhausted and hollow, but I appreciated her saying it. The sentencing hearing brought even more victim testimony. The judge allowed family members to make impact statements, and I watched 9 different people describe how my father's theft had affected their elderly relatives. Mrs. Hoffman's daughter cried while describing how her mother's stolen savings had been meant for her funeral expenses, and now the family would have to cover those costs themselves. Albert Kowalski's son talked about the betrayal of trust, how his father had believed my father was a friend who was helping him, and how learning the truth had accelerated his cognitive decline from the stress and confusion. Dorothy Chen's grandson described his grandmother's final months spent worrying about money she thought she'd spent on necessary home repairs, dying without knowing she'd been systematically robbed by someone she trusted. A woman named Violet Reeves, who I'd met multiple times during our weekend rounds, appeared in a wheelchair and testified directly to the judge about how my father had told her he was fixing her apartment's heating system while actually doing nothing, and she'd suffered through a cold winter believing the work had been done. She said the betrayal hurt worse than the stolen money because she'd thought of him as someone who cared about her well-being. The judge listened to all of this without expression, taking notes, and when the victim's statements concluded, he asked my father if he had anything to say before sentencing. My father stood and said he'd been a good father who'd provided for his family, and that he'd been destroyed by a system that didn't understand small business operations, and a son who'd been poisoned against him by malicious outside influences. He never apologized to any victim, never acknowledged any wrongdoing, never showed any remorse for the people he'd hurt. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after 8 years, and ordered restitution of $186,000 to be distributed among the documented victims. The judge said my father had engaged in predatory behavior that targeted the most vulnerable members of society, that he'd violated the trust of people who couldn't defend themselves, and that his complete lack of remorse demonstrated he'd continue this behavior if given the opportunity. He said the sentence reflected both punishment for crimes committed and protection of the community from future harm. My mother collapsed, sobbing in the courtroom, and family members rushed to support her while shooting hostile glares in my direction. I left through a side exit with Rachel and Patricia, avoiding the crowd of angry relatives in the main hallway. A local news crew was waiting outside, and a reporter named Jennifer Kim asked if I'd comment on the verdict and sentencing. I'd avoided media throughout the trial, but Patricia encouraged me to make a brief statement, saying it might help other people recognize elder abuse in their own families. I stood in front of the camera and said, "My father taught me that exploiting elderly people was normal business practice. It took an outside perspective to make me see it was systematic abuse. If you have family members who work with vulnerable populations, pay attention to their practices. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't ignore your instincts because of family loyalty." The interview aired that evening on the local news, and I received dozens of messages from strangers, some thanking me for speaking up, others calling me a traitor who destroyed his own father for publicity. I moved out of Rachel's parents' house a month after the sentencing and got my own apartment across town. Rachel and I were still together, and she'd been my primary support through the entire ordeal, but I needed some independence to process everything that had happened. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Angela Briggs, who specialized in family trauma and complicated grief. She helped me understand that I was grieving multiple losses simultaneously: the father I'd thought I had, the family identity I'd believed in, and the version of myself that had participated in hurting vulnerable people without recognizing what I was doing. She said the guilt I felt about my participation was appropriate and healthy, that it showed I'd developed moral awareness, but that I also needed to recognize the difference between childhood grooming and adult responsibility. I'd been 12 when my father first brought me into the business, too young to critically evaluate what he was teaching me. By 15 or 16, I'd had enough cognitive development to question the practices, but I'd been thoroughly indoctrinated into seeing them as normal. She said cult deprogramming followed similar patterns. People raised in destructive systems genuinely believed harmful practices were acceptable until outside perspectives provided contrast. Patricia's horror at my casual description of our business practices had been that outside perspective, and my willingness to reevaluate my beliefs and take action demonstrated strong moral character, not weakness or betrayal. I attended therapy twice a week for 8 months, slowly learning to live with the guilt and the grief while also recognizing that stopping my father had prevented future victims from being hurt. The restitution process was complicated and painful. The court had ordered my father to pay $186,000, but he had virtually no assets since he'd spent most of his fraud proceeds on his lifestyle. The court seized his bank accounts, which totaled about $14,000, and put liens on the house he and my mother owned, which was underwater on the mortgage. My mother filed for divorce immediately after the sentencing, claiming financial hardship and abandonment, trying to protect herself from the restitution obligations. The court rejected this attempt and held her partially liable as someone who'd benefited from the fraud proceeds. She was forced to sell the house, and after paying off the mortgage, the remaining equity of about $38,000 went to the restitution fund. The victims' families received partial payments, averaging about 28 cents on the dollar for what had been stolen. Mrs. Hoffman's daughter received $3,400 of the $12,000 her mother had lost. Albert Kowalski's family received $2,300 of the $8,400 stolen. Dorothy Chen's family received $2,700 of the $9,600 taken. The inadequacy of these payments was frustrating to everyone involved, but Lisa explained that restitution from convicted criminals was almost always incomplete because most criminals didn't maintain assets sufficient to cover their theft. The victims and families expressed gratitude that at least some money was recovered and that my father was in prison, unable to hurt anyone else. Several of them sent me messages thanking me for coming forward, saying they understood how difficult it must have been to testify against my own father. Mrs. Hoffman's daughter, Rebecca Hoffman, met me for coffee and told me she didn't blame me for my participation when I was younger, that she understood how family indoctrination worked, and that my decision to expose the truth had taken real courage. My relationship with my extended family was permanently destroyed. My mother cut off all contact and told relatives I was dead to her. My aunts, uncles, and most cousins sided with my parents, believing the narrative that I'd fabricated evidence or exaggerated innocent business practices into criminal acts. A few cousins reached out privately expressing support, but saying they couldn't do so publicly without being ostracized themselves. My grandfather, who'd initially supported me, died 8 months after the trial. I attended his funeral and was confronted by my mother and several relatives who told me I'd killed him through the stress of destroying our family. An uncle named Gordon physically blocked me from approaching the casket, saying I wasn't welcome to pay respects when I'd caused so much pain. Rachel's father and brother had to escort me out to prevent the confrontation from escalating. I grieved my grandfather alone, unable to participate in family mourning rituals, unable to share memories with people who'd known him longest. The isolation was crushing. Every holiday, every family milestone, every normal occasion when families gathered became a reminder of what I'd lost by choosing to expose the truth. Dr. Briggs said this isolation was common for whistleblowers, and that maintaining conviction in the rightness of my actions was essential even when the social costs felt unbearable. She connected me with a support group for people who'd been ostracized from families after exposing abuse or crime, and hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone in the experience. Rachel and I got married 2 years after the trial in a small ceremony attended by her family, a few friends, Patricia Greenfield, and some of the victims' families who'd become supportive presences in my life. Rebecca Hoffman came to the wedding and gave a speech about how justice sometimes requires sacrifice, and how watching me testify had restored her faith that good people still existed. My grandfather would have loved Rachel, would have been proud to see me marry someone so supportive and principled, but he wasn't there because the stress of the trial had apparently exacerbated his heart condition. I thought about him during the ceremony and hoped he'd understood why I'd made the choices I'd made. My mother sent a message through a cousin saying she hoped my marriage failed, and I experienced the same isolation and betrayal I'd inflicted on my family. Rachel read the message and deleted it before I could fully process the words, saying we weren't giving space in our new life to that kind of toxicity. We honeymooned in Oregon, hiking and deliberately not discussing family for an entire week. When we returned, I found a letter from my father waiting in our mailbox. He'd written from prison, 2 full pages of anger and accusations. He said I'd destroyed his life over a misunderstanding, that I'd taken normal business practices and twisted them into crimes, that I'd betrayed the man who'd raised me and taught me everything I knew. He never acknowledged that what he'd taught me was how to exploit vulnerable people. He never admitted any wrongdoing. He ended the letter saying he hoped I could live with what I'd done, and that when he got out on parole, he'd rebuild his life without me in it. I showed the letter to Rachel, and she said we should save it as evidence that he still lacked remorse, that it might be relevant for parole hearings. I filed it away and tried not to think about my father, sitting in prison, blaming me for consequences he'd brought entirely on himself. My father's first parole hearing was after serving 6 years, and I submitted a statement opposing his release. I detailed his complete lack of remorse, his continued insistence that he'd done nothing wrong, and my concerns that he'd return to targeting vulnerable elderly people if released. Multiple victims' families submitted similar statements. Patricia Greenfield submitted a professional assessment as a social worker, describing my father as a high risk for reoffending based on his maintained denial and his demonstrated skill at identifying and exploiting vulnerable populations. The parole board denied his release, citing his failure to take responsibility for his actions and his lack of participation in rehabilitative programs. My mother blamed me for this denial, sending a message through social media saying I was torturing my father by keeping him imprisoned beyond his minimum sentence. I blocked her accounts and tried to move forward. Rachel and I had a daughter by this point, Emma Grace, and I was determined to raise her with strong ethical values and the ability to question authority, even family authority. I thought about what my father had taught me, how he'd normalized exploitation and trained me to see vulnerable people as opportunities for profit. I promised myself I'd teach my daughter differently, that I'd encourage her to listen to her conscience and speak up when something felt wrong, that I'd never pressure her to participate in hurting others for family benefit. Dr. Briggs said breaking generational cycles was hard work, but essential work, and that my awareness of the patterns I wanted to avoid was the first step toward creating something better. I started volunteering with an elder advocacy organization that Patricia Greenfield recommended, working to educate seniors and their families about financial exploitation warning signs. I gave presentations at assisted living facilities and community centers, describing common scams and explaining how to protect vulnerable adults from predatory individuals. Sometimes I shared my own story as a cautionary tale about how exploitation could be normalized within families, how someone could participate in abuse without recognizing it as abuse until an outside perspective provided contrast. The presentations were hard at first because I had to repeatedly confront my own past complicity, but they felt important. Multiple families approached me after presentations saying they'd recognized similar patterns in their own situations and now understood they needed to intervene. One woman said her brother had been helping their mother with finances in ways that sounded identical to my father's practices, and my presentation had given her the language and confidence to report it to Adult Protective Services. Knowing my experience might prevent others from being victimized made the pain of my family's rejection feel slightly more purposeful. Patricia started referring people to me when they were struggling with whether to report family members for elder abuse, and I'd meet with them to share my experience and reassure them that protecting vulnerable people was more important than maintaining family harmony built on silence about abuse. My father was released on parole after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence. I received notification from the parole office because I'd registered as a victim advocate in his case. The notification included conditions of his parole, including prohibition from working with elderly individuals or in any capacity involving vulnerable populations, mandatory supervision meetings, and electronic monitoring. Patricia called to warn me that parolees often tried to contact family members who'd testified against them, either seeking reconciliation or revenge, and I should be alert for any contact attempts. My father sent a message through my mother's email within a week of release, asking to meet and clear the air. I didn't respond. He sent a follow-up message saying he'd found God in prison and wanted to make amends for the pain his actions had caused our family. I noticed he still framed his crimes as actions that caused pain to our family, rather than to the elderly victims he'd exploited, suggesting his claimed transformation was performative rather than genuine. Rachel said we should forward the messages to his parole officer, and we did, explaining that we'd requested no contact. The parole officer called to confirm my father had been warned that contacting me violated parole conditions and further attempts would result in sanctions. 2 months later, my father was arrested for parole violation after being discovered working as a senior companion through a service that placed helpers with elderly individuals. His parole officer found he'd been charging clients for services beyond what the legitimate agency billed for, essentially running his old scam through a new front. He went back to prison to serve the remaining 4 years of his original sentence with no possibility of early release. I received a letter from Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman's daughter, Rebecca, informing me that her mother had passed away peacefully at age 94. Rebecca said her mother had never fully understood what my father had done, but had occasionally mentioned the nice man who helped with her apartment. Rebecca said knowing he was in prison and couldn't hurt anyone else had given their family peace during her mother's final years. She thanked me again for having the courage to expose the truth and said she considered me family in the way that mattered, through shared values and mutual support rather than blood relation. The letter made me cry because it represented a different kind of family than the one I'd been born into, one built on respect and integrity rather than obligated loyalty. Rachel found me reading the letter at our kitchen table and sat down beside me, taking my hand. She'd been there through everything: the initial revelation, the investigation, the trial, the family rejection, the ongoing grief and guilt. Our daughter Emma was in kindergarten by then, a bright, curious child who asked constant questions about everything. She'd asked recently where Grandma and Grandpa were, why she didn't have family on Daddy's side the way she had family on Mommy's side. Rachel and I had discussed how to explain it age-appropriately, and we'd settled on telling her that sometimes families aren't safe and healthy, and it's okay to create distance from people who hurt others, even if they're related by blood. Emma had accepted this with the easy adaptability of young children and moved on to asking about dinosaurs. I was learning through her that family could be something we built intentionally, rather than something we accepted by default. 10 years after my father's original arrest, I received notification that he'd died in prison from a heart attack at age 64. The news came through an automated victim notification system, an email with subject line, "Offender Status Update," that delivered the information without emotion or ceremony. My father was dead, and I felt a complicated mix of relief that he could never hurt anyone again, and sadness for the relationship we'd never had, the father he could have been if he'd chosen differently. I didn't attend his funeral, and I didn't contact my mother to offer condolences. Rachel asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said I'd grieved my father years ago when I'd first understood who he really was. This death was just a biological conclusion to something that had ended for me emotionally a decade earlier. Dr. Briggs, who I still saw occasionally for maintenance therapy, said complicated grief was normal when losing someone who'd caused significant harm, and that I didn't owe anyone a particular emotional response just because society expected certain feelings about parental death. I thought about the elderly people he'd stolen from, about Mrs. Hoffman and Albert Kowalski and Dorothy Chen and Violet Reeves and the dozens of others whose names I'd never known. I thought about the trust he'd violated, the vulnerability he'd exploited, and the systematic cruelty he'd built a business around. And I felt certain I'd made the right choice in exposing him, even though it cost me my birth family, even though it marked me permanently as someone who'd turned on his own father. Patricia once told me that protecting vulnerable people sometimes meant sacrificing comfort and acceptance, that doing the right thing often came with significant personal cost, but that the alternative was becoming complicit in ongoing harm. I'd chosen to pay that cost, and I'd make the same choice again. My daughter Emma is 16 now, the age I was when I finally stopped working with my father. She's strong-willed, ethically minded, and questions authority reflexively in ways I encourage rather than suppress. She knows the basic story of why she doesn't have paternal grandparents, why our family consists of her maternal relatives and chosen family members rather than blood relations on both sides. Last month, she asked me directly what my father had done, and I told her the truth in age-appropriate detail. She listened carefully and said, "That must have been really hard, realizing your dad was hurting people and having to be the one to stop him." I said it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most important, because staying silent would have made me complicit in continued abuse. She said, "I'm glad you're my dad and not someone who would stay quiet about something wrong just because it was family." That moment made every painful year worthwhile because I'd broken the generational cycle my father had tried to create. raised a daughter who understood that moral courage sometimes meant standing alone, and built a life based on integrity rather than complicity. Rachel and I still volunteer with elder advocacy organizations, still give presentations about recognizing financial exploitation, still work to honor the victims my father hurt by preventing others from being similarly victimized. The disturbing thing my family convinced me was normal ended up destroying that family but creating something better in its place. A chosen family built on shared values, a marriage strengthened through crisis, a daughter raised to question rather than blindly obey, and a purpose built from preventing the harm I once unknowingly helped cause. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.